Hey everybody, it's Tom, and I wanted to come to you today to discuss briefly André Gorz' very fine text, The Critique of Economic Reason, which I have here. Not necessarily an optimal screenshot, but probably adequate for our present purposes. That's from Verso, part of their Radical Thinkers series, and it's actually a text from about 1989, 1990, so right around the turn of that decade, which signaled actually an important moment for neoliberalism, because that's really coming into the uh, the Clinton era, which sort of consolidated many of the attainments at which neoliberalism had been aiming since really the late 70s in terms of deregulation, et cetera, a sort of renaissance of laissez faire policies which availed itself of a kind of historical amnesia because the failure of those policies had become painfully conspicuous back in the 20s and 30s, where unregulated markets led to the disaster that predated the Second World War. But that's all just sort of by way of some prefatory context as to what Gorz is arguing in the Critique of Economic Reason. And what he's arguing is that, in part, this neoliberal ascendancy, which, probably more than what I was talking about, more than anything, was marked by was the collapse of the Soviet Union on a global level. A collapse which many saw as a failure of the left, as opposed to a failure of the left. And if we assume the latter position, that it was a failure of the left, we have to ask, why did that failure occur? And Gorz's contention in this text is that it comes back to the manner in which the left had almost inescapably fallen into the same logic which breeds neoliberalism, a logic of economic reason. What is economic reason? Broadly, it is reason which seeks to subordinate fiscal or economic decision, which more concretely is decision as to resource production and allocation, very clinically stated, to terms that are quantifiable and manipulable and ultimately amenable to unbounded expansion. The root of economic reason is what Habermas, I believe, termed cognitive instrumental rationality, which is sort of the premier rationality of the Enlightenment, a la Descartes, etc. Though Edmund Husserl locates it somewhat earlier in what he refers to as the mathematization of nature seen in Galileo. I'm going to come back to that theme of the mathematization of nature in Husserl's critique in another video. But to stay on point with economic rationality, what occurs is that the incredible sense of power, even though it's illusory, that can derive from a control and domination of nature quantitatively, then translates into the economic realm. The mechanism through which this occurs most conspicuously is the mechanism of commodification, whereby things are no longer produced for their use value, they are produced for their exchange value. That is, they are produced in order to exchange with another person. This leads to an alienation from a more organic relationship with the world, with the metabolism of nature, if you like. And it is not altogether a problematic development. because the distance which is acquired vis-a-vis that objectification and that commodification does create a system of remarkable efficiency that led to an amazing increase in overall productivity, which is noted by Marx himself. But the devil's in the details, right? Because that amazing increase in productivity also was predicated upon the commodification not just of goods, but of labor, which implies a reduction of the human being in himself or herself to starkly mechanistic, mechanical terms. They become part of an enormous machine, the economy, and the psychological, the existential upshot of their alienation is one which puts them at a distance from their own fulfillment and puts any society which centralizes that logic at a distance from its function, which in my view would be to abet, to facilitate the fulfillment of all who are participating in that society. Now, this is where we get to Gorz's specific contribution, because all we've said so far is very sort of de rigueur of anybody who follows Marxist or anarchist or broadly left critical thinking. His unique contribution is this. It's like, well, here's what Marx thought. Marx thought that, and it's sort of a dialectical flourish, that the working class, collectively subjected to this alienation, might actually use it as a fulcrum from which to ultimately emancipate themselves from two tyrannies. The one being the tyranny of, in this case, the bourgeois or the capitalist class, but the other being the tyranny of nature, the tyranny of biologically imposed necessity. And in a sense, this latter victory was already implicitly won through the alleged domination of nature a la natural science, which was being implemented in the industrial economy. But that victory notwithstanding was beneficial only to a few, those at the commanding heights of the economy, the bourgeois. The problem with the analysis that Marx forwards, which isn't entirely fruitless, according to Gorz, is that it fails to appreciate how dramatically fragmenting the logic of work under capitalism actually is, how incredibly atomizing it is, so that this class solidarity is actually, that could have been the foundation of a revolution, is actually undercut by the framework from which it seeks its impetus, and the contradiction is a vicious one. So I want to try and make that a little bit more concrete. How does this actually cash out? Well, one very important way in which it cashes out pertains to how technology informs the process of production. Under the capitalist dispensation, which is a dispensation that is grounded in economic rationality that seeks to quantify and facilitate unended expansion, efficiency becomes an enormous driver. And the formation of technology becomes subordinate to that term. The irony is that this ultimately leads to a displacement of the labor force's actual participation in the creation of society's goods. They themselves become displaced from engaging material nature and are only ultimately sort of adjunct to the machines, sort of a premier inversion of means and ends. in the light of this alienation, you don't only acquire a distance from the work process, you actually also acquire a distance from your fellow workers, since you're all merely cogs that, the space within which sociality can occur becomes compromised. Now, initially, this was mitigated by things like factory space, but as forms of technological organization and the machines themselves developed and the efficiency enhanced, those mitigants proved insufficient to the task of resisting that atomization, the alienation, which was at their root, which leads us to why the left has failed. The left has failed because it had placed its bets on the number that working class solidarity could be established and ultimately revolutionary despite the force of these mitigating currents. But unfortunately, that bet came out short. Which brings us to, and that it came out short is illustrated by the collapse of the Soviet Union, by the neoliberal ascendancy with which we are living presently, even now, 30 some years on from the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's sort of monstrously illustrated also in a figure like Donald Trump coming into the presidency and with minimal resistance implementing disastrous policies. Just sort of most recently, not most recently, but just as an example, you can look at his devastation of environmental regulations, which though actually very, weak, are still non-trivial. And you have this idea that, for example, the Endangered Species Act should be revised to make it subordinate to an economic calculus and all the rest of it. So, what does the left have to do to recover from this impasse? And Gorz's answer is to reframe the issue in terms of autonomy. Previously, autonomy, which he sets up as opposed to heteronomy. Now, what do we mean by this? What we mean is that historically, instead of the tension being autonomy versus heteronomy, self-appropriation of one's life, self-control of one's life, one's existence, the autonomy was freedom versus necessity, which is tied up with our with the exigencies of our mortal life, both as individuals and as a society. Under capitalism, the market is what commands what we should do through our time, through the commodification of labor, so that we are thus heteronomy, thus we live in an alienated society. Very few of us actually have control of our own time. And such leisure as we have is merely compensatory for the efforts we put forth in order to survive. Autonomy would invert this and signal that the work that we do should be subordinate to what we want to do. That autonomy or control over our lives should be more important than what the market dictates we should be doing with our lives. The linchpin for accomplishing this inversion is temporality or time. And so this analysis sort of back in the 80s, early 90s really anticipates suggestions of later thinkers like David Graeber, and the whole notion of bullshit jobs and all the rest of it, where what you actually have is a proliferation of useless work in order to justify the perpetuation of an economy which is dramatically overproductive, but still seals most people off from fulfilling participation in um, in that fruits of that production because of the wage relationship at its roots. And the way that our time is dominated by the imperative of this uselessness sort of is how that manifests most explicitly. So, for most people in the United States, which is one of the wealthiest, if not still the wealthiest country in the world, to really live in a, human way, you have to be working somewhere in the vicinity of 50, 60 hours a week, despite the fact that you have formally a 40-hour work week. That 40-hour work week is just not, for most people, given the average weights of wage, to give them income which is going to be adequate to their tasks. So what we have to do is we have to sever the connection between income and time worked. And this involves a reimagination of things like property and an understanding that we have to reassert categories which have sort of, received some lip service, but I think not enough like actual effort. Categories like the commons and democratic leadership, real, like radical democratic leadership over workplace and production, and a realization that whatever comes out of any given workplace or production, the fruits of that should be shared by the people who actually do the work, not by the ownership. So this is still fundamentally socialist. And what do we mean by socialist? We mean by socialist that we are going to subordinate economic ends to social ends. What we have is the inverse at present, where the ideal of economic growth is considered more important than how we lead our lives. And I think that Gorz is pretty much, if you will indulge the irony, on the money in emphasizing this issue of time. You need to move to a space where we really aren't working more than 20 hours a week, if that. Because the reality is that with the technology and resources available, that is more than enough to sustain a truly fulfilling life. I mean, there are, ways of going about that. And he gets into the details, some interesting proposals. And I won't get into them right now at the moment. I just wanted to serve that. So that's just an initial overview of his main argument in the critique of economic reason, and this notion that the left should reimagine itself in terms of an ideal of autonomy and giving people control over their lives more directly through a lessening of actual work time. And this actually intersects with some thoughts of David Harvey, and I think I'm going to take up a text from him next, and probably his, I'll come into that in the next video. So I'm sorry if I probably should have made that a little bit more concise than I did, but I like to be relatively extemporaneous in my remarks in these videos, perhaps out of a, romantic fidelity to the notion of authenticity. So not that authenticity necessarily precludes the idea of more formal presentations, but for me this just feels more organic. All right, that was somewhat self-indulgent remark to conclude. So thank you for forgiving that. Anyway, so there you are, some thoughts on André Gorz and his critique of economic reason. I exhort you to go either check out his book, or he's got lots of great essays out there. One interesting essay, for example, that you might check out is his essay on the motor car, as he called it, or the automobile, and its implications for society. All right, that's all for now, guys. I'll catch you soon. Ciao for now.